It's really difficult to describe just how influential Need for Speed was in the 2000s. Just anecdotally, I could tell you that most of my friends, who have very little interest in the genre today, played the Underground series at release. On a more empirical note, I could point to the fact that Underground sold over 7 million copies in just half a year. Its sequel obliterated those numbers in just over a month. And if I were to mention the very next title in the series, their best-selling game in the series to date, then I would probably be here all day.
Everyone.
But, to what I'm sure will be disappointing to hear for some, this video isn't about Need for Speed, because the Electronic Arts flagship racing franchise is pretty well documented at this point. We all know how Underground helped to popularize the street racing phenomenon within the racing game community, building off of the sudden success of the Fast and Furious, and I don't think I can really bring anything new to the table if I were to make a video about those games. However, there is another tuner culture racing franchise, one that predates both the Underground series and the film that inspired it by over 2 years. One that, considering the pedigree of its publisher, doesn't get anywhere near as much mention as the aforementioned giant. And it's one that I've had the joy of experiencing for the very first time for this video. I am, of course, referring to the Midnight Club series. If you are a fan of this channel, there's a good chance that you probably enjoy a bit of the old racing game here and there. After all, I think the vast majority of my subscribers came from the Juiced 2 video I made last year. And to run the risk of projecting a little bit here, I would be surprised if the #1 spot on your favorite racing games list was reserved by a Midnight Club game. And that's kind of weird, right? Everyone's heard of Midnight Club. How could you not have? I mean, under Grand Theft Auto, I felt like this was emerging as Rockstar's next most popular IP. And yet, here we are now, almost 15 years after the release of the last game in the franchise, with no plans for a revival in sight. Surely, that bodes well for the quality of game that I'm about to experience. Right? Well, let's find out. And to do that, we're gonna jump back all the way to the year 2000, barely even a month after the release of the PlayStation 2. We're gonna jump back to Midnight Club Street Racing. Oh my god.
I'm not Justin Bieber.
Now wait just 2 seconds. If you're familiar with the Midnight Club franchise, you may have noticed that there is a section missing. Midnight Club Los Angeles is going to receive a video all of its own in the near future. Pretty much all of the games in this series, apart from one, are console-exclusive titles. And while I pretty much managed to get all the 6th console generation games running without any issues, the same could not be said about the last game in the series. I want to make sure that I'm having an accurate experience with these games, so I'm going to postpone the 4th Midnight Club game to a later video once I manage to get it working properly. Alright, now, back to this hot mess. Before I start completely shitting all over this game, I just want to make one thing clear. Whenever you make a video about an older game, especially if you have negative opinions about it, you always run the risk of denigrating the feelings of someone in the audience. A person who perhaps has many fond memories of playing the game that you're actively tearing into. I hope this goes without saying, but you shouldn't take my opinions of games I don't really like too seriously. After all, I'm experiencing these games for the first time, and nostalgia is a hell of a drug. With that out of the way, let's immediately piss everyone off with the fact that I think it's absolutely incredible that this game got a sequel, let alone 3 more mainline entries after this. If I had found this game on Steam's early access section, I wouldn't even bat an eye. I was going to try and explain the way that this game looks by keeping in mind how early on this game came out in the PS2's life. If there's one thing that has become evident with console games is that they tend to start looking better as developers get used to their architecture. They learn how to squeeze every last bit of power out of them as time goes on. But then I started digging a little bit, and Yeah, there are launch day titles that look nowhere near like this. But I've mentioned in many of my other videos that I really don't care that much about graphics in games. In fact, I find the way Midnight Club Street Racing looks to be quite charming, as unintentional as it is. Everything from the one-tone textures to the crude character portraits to the fucking insane techno drum and bass music that the game blasts into your ears as you're driving about just all adds up to that early 2000s vibe. You could unironically make a case for Midnight Club Street Racing to be historically preserved in a video game equivalent of the National Film Registry. Hell, the subtitles under all the game's options would earn that status for me alone. Career? 9 to 5. Extras? Show us the goods. Save? Lock it up, baby! I'm also willing to give Angel Studios, the actual developers behind the game, who would later become Rockstar San Diego, the benefit of the doubt a little bit. There are two completely open cities in the game, representing New York City and London, that you can drive around freely. And these are surprisingly big for the time, so much so that I'm willing to bet that the bad graphics were necessary to get the game to run smoothly. And besides, it's a racing game. It could look like fucking Battlezone for all I care, as long as the gameplay is good. So, is it?
Hey, don't get left behind. Bye-bye.
Yeah, not really. When you start a new game, after going through the most annoying profile creator I've experienced in a long time, you're thrown into the open world in your starter taxicab next to... what's this guy's name again?
Yo, I'm Emilio Sanchez from Uptown, baby. Hold on to your seat.
Right, of course. So there's really two options for you here. You can either start driving around the city aimlessly, or most people will notice the obvious green arrow above Emilio Sanchez from Uptown Baby and decide to follow him. This is how every race in the career mode is initiated. You find a man. Get close enough to them so that the red arrow above them turns green, then follow them to where the race start is. It's actually not that different from any of the other Midnight Club games in that regard. However, this gets old very quickly. And it really just boils down to the fact that the game doesn't show you where the starting line is. So when you are following one of these men, and they inevitably make a sudden turn that sends you flying straight into a head-on collision with a mid-X van, you're probably not going to be able to catch up to them again in your shitty starter car. And if that green arrow above their car turns red, well...
she's just GG, guys.
You'll have to catch up to them and go through that entire ordeal again. The worst thing about this whole part of the game, other than the fact that they seem to be really intent on getting away from you, I'm not surprised by that actually, your character is literally JC fucking Denton in canon, is that their AI is frankly dog shit at doing the one thing they're meant to do. You know, drive. If by some miracle you manage to get to the starting line of your race without your eliminating himself off of a wall or tree, then you should immediately go and open up a case in CSGO, or whatever people do these days. Roblox? Yeah, I'm not a massive fan of this part of the game. I'm glad that they managed to get it right eventually, even if it did take them 2 more mainline entries. Alright, fine, so initiating the races sucks. We get it, Hub. What we're here for is the racing. Which race is the best race? No. Surely this is where Midnight Club Street Racing peaked, right? How else could it have sold over 1.5 million copies on the PlayStation 2 alone? Hub, please give us the goods.
It's not looking good, bruv. It's not looking good.
I really did go into this game with an open mind, because sure, it looks... well, it looks, but this wouldn't have been the first time I've played a franchise that had a humble beginning in that regard. Before I talk about how the cars handle, I think I'll start with how the actual races work, because that's one place where all of the games in the series are quite similar. There are technically 2 types of races in Midnight Club Street Racing, though really they involve you doing pretty much the exact same thing. You drive through multiple checkpoints across the map before hitting the finish line. The city remains completely open during every event, so you can experiment with shortcuts and alternate routes to try and beat your opponents. For the first type of event, the route is quite obvious, usually a fairly straight line where the order of the checkpoints doesn't require much thought. The other type is quite strange, however. Some events will place you in an absolute clusterfuck of these checkpoints scattered all around you. When I first saw this, I thought it was going to be your standard circuit race. You'd probably have to drive through each checkpoint in the correct order for them to count. That's not what this is it? No, you can drive through these checkpoints in any order you like. I don't really have a problem with this sort of race type in theory. I don't mind the fact that the Need for Speed games around this time put up these impassable barriers to keep you from leaving the track during an event, though I can accept that it's probably not the best way to do this sort of thing. The way that the Midnight Club games do this with the checkpoint system has the advantage of letting the player traverse through them in any way they like, finding little shortcuts or alternate routes that may or may not let them get to each checkpoint a little faster. However, I'm not really a fan of the way that this is implemented in this specific event type, because sure, you technically have the freedom to hit these objectives in any order you want, but there's fundamentally always going to be a most optimal order, one which I suspect the navigation arrow is always pointing you towards. So what's the point in being able to hit these checkpoints in any order you want if there's really only one way to do it the fastest? Besides that, I just have a feeling that the devs wanted to have a standard circuit mode in place, but either couldn't get it to work for one reason or another, or someone had this idea for a mode where you can run through checkpoints in any order you like, and it just kind of stuck. I've also never really been a massive fan of most open-world checkpoint-based racing events in games for a couple of reasons. One big one is that they force you to have to pay a lot of attention to the minimap, inevitably forcing you to take your eyes off the road more often than you would like, and making more mistakes because of it. And that navigation arrow they have in place isn't a good alternative, because it doesn't stop pointing to your next checkpoint until you've ran through it. So if there is a sudden turn you have to make directly after the fact, you won't know until it's too late. It's a similar problem to what would happen in Underground 2, but at least in that game you don't have to rely on the GPS arrow during races. And the last short point I want to make in this section in the video is the level design. Grid-style cities aren't fun to race in. It's either straight lines all the way through or sudden 90-degree turns. I've played maybe a little over 2 hours of Midnight Club street racing for this video, and not only have I not unlocked any new cars, but I've also not unlocked the London map yet. I can start a free roam on it in the arcade menu, but I don't have any of the events unlocked. And that's really sad, considering how much more fun it looks compared to the boring grids of Manhattan. There's actual winding roads on that map, meaning you can't just turn your brain off and hold X through the whole thing. But maybe even starting you off on that map wouldn't have saved this game in the end. Because, well, I think it's time to talk about the handling. I tend to have this preconceived bias against old racing video games. Whenever I think about them, my thoughts always drift towards outdated controls, horrible physics, and in general just a massive waste of time. And yet, this bias has been proven wrong time and time again as I've visited older games, especially when it comes to Need for Speed. I played the Need for Speed for the first time recently, on DOSBox, with no sound. And yet I was astonished at just how good that game feels to play considering its age. I have a theory for why I might have these negative connotations with older games, though you will have to wait until a later section in this video to find out. So why did I just say all that? Because Midnight Club Street Racing is exactly everything I fear when visiting these old racing titles. To say that this game has physics would be an insult to Newton himself. It's actually really hard to describe how this game feels to control. Sometimes it almost feels like there's some actual weight to the vehicles you're driving, especially if you manage to get some air or when you hit one of these unsuspecting civilians on the side of the street. Is that ragdoll physics? In 2000, there were some genuine surprises for me in that regard with Midnight Club Street Racing. Pedestrians really do seem to turn into ragdolls when you hit them, and when you manage to hit a jump at a weird angle that gets your car spinning, it really does look quite impressive for the time. That paired with the fact that vehicles have a damage model in this game actually gave me some Burnout vibes. Fuck. Those were good games.
A little bit chicken fried. Kill a bear on a
And on a little side note, since I just mentioned it, it's refreshing to finally play a street racing game that actually has pedestrians walking around that you can hit. I swear I'm not a psychopath. But then the vast majority of the time you'll be driving around and you hit a wall. Memes ensue. Or you pull the handbrake and... well, that doesn't feel quite right. Or you'll hit a turn at full speed and take absolutely no penalty to your momentum. Now those are some hub-tech tires right there, let me tell you. One thing that really makes the driving in this game feel so odd is that your tires just seem to have unlimited grip unless you use the handbrake. This has the side effect I mentioned just moments ago, where you can fully steer into corners without slowing down. And if you're using the directional buttons to steer as opposed to the analog stick, then my thoughts and prayers go out to anyone unfortunate enough to be sitting in your passenger seat. Play the game that way and suddenly there is no grace period between going straight and hitting a full turn. Another effect of the sheer grip of these tires is what sometimes happens when you crash. Because your wheels keep spinning, and you have the best rubber in all of Tamriel, as soon as your wheels touch the ground again, you'll be shot off in whatever direction you are facing. You can sometimes use the steered advantage, come to a tight turn that you don't want to slow down for, so you hit a wall at enough of an angle to shoot yourself onwards. But then you get the occasional time where your car actually catches some air because of it, spins around, and then you end up launching yourself into the opposite direction, or into another car. This is another reason for why these weird circuit-esque events fucking suck. Your opponents will sometimes come at you head on, and if they hit you, there's no guessing where you're gonna end up. And well, there isn't that much more to say about this one. I mean, I could go on a bit, but we're only on the first out of 4 games in the series. And the beauty of this video format is that I can reference back to each individual game as similarities and differences crop up. But there's still one question I asked a while ago that needs an answer. Just how did this game sell well enough to not only earn a spot for Angel Studios under the Rockstar umbrella, but also to be successful enough to launch an entire franchise from? The answer to that is quite simple. When Midnight Club Street Racing came out back in the year 2000, there was simply nothing else to play on the PlayStation 2. Now, where have we heard that one before? Sony. Fans of the racing game genre wouldn't be blessed with the third installment of Gran Turismo for another 5 months. And in general, 2001 was the year where the console really started to take off, with titles like Grand Theft Auto 3 and Metal Gear Solid 2. That's all to say that Midnight Club Street Racing was just good enough to keep people busy before bigger developers got around to releasing their games on the console. Had this game been released even a year later, I can imagine a world where this entire series of games was just never seen to fruition. Midnight Club Street Racing is a fairly simple game. It wasn't very fun to play now, but I imagined I would have probably sunk a few hours into it had I owned it as a kid. 3 out of 10. It's not good. I have a confession to make up front before I start talking about Midnight Club 2, that being that I have actually played this one before, and I was reminded of that fact when I booted up the game for the first time and heard that theme in the main menu. However, I was so young when I first played Midnight Club 2 that I don't really remember much about it, other than one thing I will go into later. So while I have technically played this game before, I was pretty much experiencing it properly for the first time for this video. The jump in quality between Street Racing and this is quite remarkable in every category. The first thing I noticed was just how different the tone of this game is compared to its predecessor. Gone are the days of early dubstep and drum and bass music. That was like 3 years ago, old man. This is the new, modern Midnight Club game. You can tell by the cool, atmospheric synth thing we've got going on. This whole main menu on its own is just such a vibe. The only way I can describe it is that it has the Matrix energy, and that's probably not a coincidence. And then you start the actual game, and it's nothing but rap. I have nothing against rap music at all. It fits with the last 2 games in this series, but it's just so different from the sort of tone I felt they were trying to set up in the menu. It's like the entire main menu was made by a couple of contractors who had absolutely zero communication with the rest of the game's developers. This isn't the only area in which Midnight Club is inconsistent, but we'll get to those shortly. I guess the idea with the music was to invoke themes between the different cities in the game. Similarly to how Street Racing had Manhattan and London, Midnight Club 2 starts you off in LA, before moving through the cities of Paris and Tokyo. When it comes to the soundtrack in LA, you're not looking at much more than a lot of gang shit. It's not until you reach either Paris or Tokyo that things start to get a little more interesting. I think think this sort of music fits the game a lot better than what the game plays by default in LA. And fortunately, you can switch between the game's soundtracks in the options menu. Unfortunately though, this setting will revert to default anytime you start a new race. Nice going there, Rockstar. Something that makes Midnight Club 2 stand out in particular is the fact that this was the only game in the series to have had an official PC release. And to my surprise, it still runs on Windows 11 with absolutely no compatibility problems, even treating you to luxuries such as a widescreen 1080p resolution. However, I cannot recommend this version of the game because of one massive flaw with the way the game controls. Unless you figure out a way to play it with a controller. Because if you intend to play Midnight Club 2 with a keyboard, then you're going to have to deal with this. Similarly to how street racing controlled when using your directional buttons on the controller, steering in this game with your keyboard is completely binary. You're either going straight or you're making a full turn. There is nothing in between. This seemed so bizarre to me that I had to go and confirm how the game controlled on the PS2. And while using the analog stick made the cars a lot more controllable with finer inputs, you can still jam it in either direction without a delay, which feels a little bit off compared to a lot of other games I'm used to. The handling of your cars in general has seen somewhat of an improvement in Midnight Club 2. There's a decent physics engine that doesn't only switch on when you hit a jump, unlike the previous game. Grip is also more of a concern, as it should be, though understeer doesn't seem to be a thing in this universe. In fact, I think that the cars are still way too grippy. You do have to be careful about losing grip in the rear and spinning out of control around corners. And turning actually carries a significant penalty to your speed, meaning that you have to try and avoid turning too harshly at high speeds if you want to stay in the lead during a race. Maybe the developers actually got the opportunity to drive a car in between the making of Street Racing and Midnight Club 2. Those are all really good, much needed changes, but they make driving with a keyboard on PC an absolute nightmare. Simple things, such as dodging traffic, become a fucking chore, because the slightest tap of a directional button can send you off to the moon and back. You remember how I mentioned that bias I had against older racing video games earlier? I shit you not, I think all of that was single-handedly born out of the few hours of experience I had with Midnight Club 2 on PC when I was young. Because even though I barely remember playing this game, that one little detail about how it controlled was burned into my memory. I remember seeing a few comments on the video I made about Juiced 2, from people who grew up only playing on consoles, saying something to the effect of, well, yeah, what did you expect when you tried playing a racing game with a keyboard? Of course the controls are going to be bad. And that seems like a good argument, if you've never tried to play a good racing game that's actually had some thought put into it in that department. I didn't get my first console until around 2007, by which time I was already a super fan of the Need for Speed games. I played every single game in that franchise from Porsche Unleashed to Most Wanted on PC, with a keyboard. And not once during that time did I ever think that my experience would have been improved had I played them with a controller. And that's because the developers actually put some time into making sure that playing with a keyboard felt good. It takes time to fully steer in those games, making fine adjustments much more manageable, and cars and Need for Speed games tend to have a lot more weight to them, making their handling a lot more predictable in some ways, whilst adding more of a challenge in others. Compare that to Midnight Club 2, where you can steer instantly, and all of the cars seem to weigh around the same as Eugene Kuni. Even so, you're mostly going to be seeing footage from the PC version, since I was having trouble emulating this one with PCSX2. Either I was going to be playing the entire game in software mode, which looks like this, or I was going to be stubborn, grinding through the terrible controls of the PC version because it looks better for the video. There are a couple of other similarities that were carried over from the previous game. For starters, the way in which you initiate races is almost identical. The only improvement here is that you don't have to follow your rival for a specified amount of time before they finally decide that you do, in fact, want to challenge them to a race. You can now flash your lights at them to initiate the pursuit instantly, eliminating some of the tedium. However, everything else about them is equally as shit as it was in Street Racing, even down to the fact that the rival AI still has the tendency to both crash and to drive in a way that makes it really hard for the player to predict where the hell they're going. Look at this clip for example. I initiate the race, start following the car, and out of nowhere he decides it's time to do a complete 180. Or this clip here. Looks like he's gonna keep going straight, right? Nope, it's like he's making it up on the fucking spot. And I think I've made my point, but here's one more for good measure. It's like he's teasing me here. Am I gonna go right? Am I gonna go straight? Nope, I'm gonna go left. Keep up, fucker. Before I talk about the racing, I guess this would be a good time to point out another slight improvement over the original. The characters you race against are a little bit more developed, though not necessarily in a writing kind of way.
What you got, friend? Ready to read my plates?
All of your rivals have pre-rendered cutscenes now, which I must admit gives the game a more tangible sense of identity and style, especially compared to whatever the hell this was.
Now you're gonna get the Emilio treatment big time.
That being said, these cutscenes bring up one of those other inconsistencies I talked about earlier. None of these character models seem to follow any sort of unifying art direction. The first person you race is old Moses over here, who, you know, has a bit of a cartoony, larger-than-life kind of thing going on. In more ways than one. Then you'll come across someone like Steven or Angel, and they just look like dudes. And then you come across this fucking alien that calls itself Maria. What the fuck is that? I'm serious, look me in the eyes and tell me that these people are in the same game as this guy. Or Leafy is here, and I quickly learned to expect the unexpected whenever one of these cutscenes started playing. At the very least, I can appreciate the effort of trying to give the game a little bit more character. And since you're going to be seeing these cutscenes anytime you initiate a race, it's probably time to talk about how those compare to the first game. Open world, checkpoint-based racing is the name of the game when it comes to the entire Midnight Club series, though each of the separate entries iterate upon them in one way or another. For instance, the two whole event types that were present in Street Racing are all here in the sequel, though there are a couple of others that have also been added. They figured out how to do proper circuit races, for example, and they have a new mode they occasionally throw at you that starts you off in a pursuit against the police. You have to lose them, then beat your opponent to the finish line. This would be an interesting event type if the police in this game wasn't childishly easy to evade, basically making it a free win. The two event types that make a comeback are your sprint type races, as well as those random checkpoint order ones that I complained about earlier. And really, all of my complaints about the latter type still stand in Midnight Club 2, so I'm not going to talk about it much more than just saying that it's still my least favorite. I think the only way they could have fixed this event type would be to put the checkpoints in the midpoints of roads, like they sometimes do in sprint races, as opposed to junctions like is done currently. This would let the navigation arrow show you what direction you need to go before you get to your next junction, instead of having to instantly adapt to wherever the hell it decides to point you the very same frame you should be making the turn in the first place. It's a guessing game that gets quite tiring. It's annoying when you have a race with a cluster of checkpoints all around each other, coupled with the vast amount of traffic you now have to dodge. Sprint races have seen one major improvement. Your minimap now only shows you 2 waypoints at any given time, your current one in light blue and the following checkpoint in dark blue. It's a good change because you can quickly look down and know exactly where you're going without having the minimap be overwhelmed by dozens of checkpoints you really don't need to see at this stage in the race. I also feel like the directional arrows on the checkpoints themselves are a lot more clear and easy to see. However, Midnight Club 2 also introduces a new problem with the checkpoint system due to a new map feature. Most of the maps in the game have some level of verticality, especially LA. You have your normal street level like you do in Street Racing, though the game now also has highways, as well as other elevated structures you can drive on. This is a cool change in some ways, it certainly adds a lot of variety to your races. However, as you progress through the game, and the structures of each event get more complex, you'll start to notice that the checkpoint system isn't as clear in telling you where you need to go as it should be. There was one race I did against Dice, where this became an issue. I was completely dominating the other contestants for reasons I will get into in a few minutes. However, when I got to my last checkpoint, I couldn't figure out where the hell to go. Looking back at the footage, I think I was meant to take this jump onto the highway, but assuming the player is going to know that without any clue to that fact is a massive ask, especially considering that this entire race up to this point took place on the streets. A simple solution to that would have been to place a waypoint right before the jump. This problem showed itself all over the place in Midnight Club 2, and while sometimes I got lucky and just so happened to go the way the devs intended, I never really felt confident my first time through an event. Later on in the game, where the difficulty drops out of nowhere, I found myself restarting quite often purely because the game would throw one of these bullshit checkpoints at me without warning. One other issue I've come across is that some of the race structures feel uninspired. The further I got through the game, the more checkpoints I noticed that pointed me 180 degrees in the opposite direction I just came from. It just feels a bit off, like they ran out of ideas. Which is actually how I feel about why they spawn all of this traffic during races. Because you see, events in Midnight Club 2 have been handcrafted. Tailored even, with triggers for the player to run through that spawn scripted traffic at the worst possible times. It's like someone at Rockstar said, these races aren't hard enough. How can we make them more hard? I know, just spawn a massive fucking truck when you get near this tight intersection. Still, having said all of that, I overall enjoyed racing in Midnight Club 2 more over street racing. I think the handling and difficulty versus the AI mostly made up for a lot of these shortcomings. Because for the first dozen or so races, I found myself losing. Like, a lot. Let's talk about the difficulty. Initially, when I first started working on this video, this was going to be where I had a big criticism to make. The first couple of hours in Midnight Club 2 are quite difficult. In fact, there are some races that you just straight up cannot win, depending on the order you take them in. However, looking back now, I think that this is a fine way of doing difficulty. You cannot upgrade your cars in this game. The only way to progress is to beat your rivals and win their cars, each of which may come with a new feature like nitrous or the ability to shift your car's weight in mid-air, just to name a few. This was a little frustrating for me initially. How was I supposed to beat someone with a clearly superior car if I couldn't even upgrade my engine or my suspension? And I think the answer is that you're not supposed to. If you run into a race that you cannot win, there will more than likely be another driver that you can challenge free roaming around that you can beat in your current car. Once you beat them and acquire their vehicle, that other driver that beat your ass over and over again will all of a sudden be a lot easier to defeat, making your well-earned win that much sweeter. And this would be really cool if your progression was balanced like this throughout the entire game. Except it's not. There were two unlocks that I got one after the other that completely broke the game's difficulty for me. The slipstream boost and the first motorcycle you get in the game after beating Gina's second event. The slipstream boost rewards you for being anywhere but in first place, so even when I started facing contestants that should have beat me without much of a problem, I could just tail them for a few seconds and then boost to get myself out in front, meaning that I rarely ever lost from this point on. The bike was the final nail in the coffin. Every race felt like a walk in the park with this thing. You don't get a can of nitrous for it like you do with most other cars, but that doesn't matter. Because not only do you still have your slipstream, but motorcycles in Midnight Club 2 also have their own infinite form of boost. Simply pop a wheelie and watch as you effortlessly pass every single one of your contestants. I guess some things just never change, huh, Rockstar? Couple this with its more precise handling that felt great to drive even with the keyboard, which is completely baffling to me how they got this right with the bikes and not with the fucking cars, and I never really felt the need to drive anything else in the game after unlocking it. And sure, it comes with the challenge of your character being able to fall off the bike if you get hit hard enough, which takes a few seconds to reset. But the thing is that the speed advantage is so great in this thing that even if you do fall off, you'll most likely be ahead of everyone else by so much that it's really not even an issue. I think there are a couple of ways in which this could have been fixed. I think the devs were onto something with the removal of nitrous for the motorcycles. They just didn't take it far enough. I think that the superior handling and the small size that the bikes offer would have been more than enough to entice players to use them for certain events over cars. Maybe popping a wheelie could have been used to accelerate quickly from a standstill, or even at low speeds to give you an edge at the starting line or at slower turns, leaving the ability to lean into your bike unchanged as is currently in the game. Because as it stands now, I've never seen a reason for why I should lean in for that tiny speed boost if I could just wheelie with no real downsides. Maybe have it instead so that you cannot turn when performing a wheelie, exchanging a loss in maneuverability for a burst of speed. Or have that ability be used in some other unique way, like maybe if you're about to hit a car or some other similarly sized object, you could pop a wheelie to launch yourself into the air. That could have some other unforeseen consequences, I admit, but I'm just spitballing ideas here. Because clearly something is wrong here the way things are now, and I really think it could have been avoided. Before I finish this section of the video, I do want to throw out a bit of praise towards Midnight Club 2, because it really does deserve it in a lot of places. I think this game looks great, for instance. It's definitely aged, don't get me wrong, but it's got a very clean look to it. The 3 cities you can drive through have clearly had a lot of work put into them to make them feel somewhat real. Again, we're talking 2003 standards here, so be nice. Shops have JPEGs of interiors plastered to their windows and doors, with lighting emanating through them, which, yeah, looks terrible if you actually stop and look at them up close, but they really add to the feeling that you're driving through actual cities. This is also coupled with the fact that the capacity for pedestrians and civilian traffic has seen a big increase since the last game in the series. Though I think the pedestrians in Street Racing were a little better in the way they reacted to you barreling down towards them at high speeds. Speaking of cities, the maps in Midnight Club 2 all look and feel like the places they're supposed to represent, even having specific landmarks such as the Eiffel Tower in Paris, or this place in LA that I only know because of GTA 5. Let's go gamers. Some other miscellaneous details I didn't find a way to include in the rest of the script include brake discs glowing bright orange with excessive use, an overall decent looking lighting system for the time that the game came out, and that the models of civilian vehicles change depending on what map you're on. It's the sort of thing that shows me that the devs actually cared about the game they were making to put small details like that in there. While ultimately flawed, I genuinely found Midnight Club 2 to be a very enjoyable racing game. Where Street Racing felt like a underdeveloped game, likely done so to capitalize on the early PlayStation 2 market, Midnight Club 2 feels like the game Angel Studios, or Rockstar San Diego, likely wanted to make from the very beginning. But if there's one thing that sums this game up for me, it's that it feels like the series was still trying to find its footing with Midnight Club 2. A lot of the things I've complained about seem like they can be boiled down to inexperience in this specific niche genre, and in all fairness, these guys were ahead of their time in that regard. And putting my Need for Speed bias aside for just one moment, especially because this game came out months before Underground, I think this is a solid game that deserves the fandom it has accumulated over the years. 5 out of 10.
That's alright.
My understanding is that fans' opinions tend to be pretty evenly split between the last two games in the Midnight Club franchise as to which of them is the better entry. And while I'll be sure to give my own opinion on that in my Midnight Club LA video, it's undeniable that Rockstar had learned some major lessons with this third game, both with their own series of games up to this point, but also with what was going on around them in the racing game genre near the time that this game came out. I imagine that it probably dawned on Rockstar that some big changes had to be made to how they progressed with this series if they wanted to remain relevant against the overnight success of the Underground games. The sort of simple progression that was present in Midnight Club 2 wasn't going to cut it anymore. People were spoiled with in-game currency rewards for winning races now, money which they can spend on licensed cars, with dozens of unique customization options for each individual vehicle. The cars they drove were no longer hand-me-downs they received from the plebs they raced against. They were much more than that now. Their own riced-out, bastardized, ticking head gasket time bomb fart machines. And they loved it. I guess we'll have to see if 2005's Midnight Club 3 was up to the challenge. But first, I have to mention my own challenge in getting this fucking game to run properly. We're back to console exclusives now, and I have bad news for anyone who wants to play this game without having either a PlayStation 2 or an original Xbox. There is no perfect emulating solution for experiencing Midnight Club 3, at least in my experience. I was going to try and emulate the Xbox version first for a change, as that seemed to be the superior version of the game in a lot of ways. Everything was looking great in the main menu, the game ran smoothly, I selected my first shitbox, and then the game looked like this. I don't usually mind some minor graphical glitches with emulated games, but this specific bug rendered the game pretty much unplayable due to the simple fact that you cannot see. Alas, undefeated, I tried the PS2 version, which didn't feel as smooth in the menu, but thankfully played fine enough for the most part. There were still some graphical glitches present, again with the lights funnily enough, though it may be difficult to see with YouTube's video compression. For this reason, you'll see a lot of footage of me playing the game in software mode, which eliminates pretty much all of the visual bugs and is more true to how the game would have actually looked on the PlayStation 2's hardware from what I understand. The downside, of course, is that the resolution takes a big hit, which I'm sure is a big deal to some, but it shouldn't really take away from the main game experience, which is all I really care about at the end of the day. Because in every other way, there are already a lot of noticeable improvements present here over the last two games.
Hey, I just hooked up your ride, ese.
I worked the engine with a new air intake, turbo, headers, and exhaust system.
The tone of Midnight Club 3 is a hell of a lot more consistent throughout the whole game, and I can imagine that the switch from these globe-trotting adventures that were sort of a big part of the last two entries, to having a game that is purely set in the United States, is what had a big impact in making the whole experience feel a little bit more well put together. The soundtrack alone is a great example of the direction this game took in the series. We, of course, have the game's main theme in the main menu, which is a banger, I can't lie. But the rest of the soundtrack, while hosting a wide range of different genres and styles, fits in together very well with this illegal street racing experience. There wasn't really even a single time where I would be driving about in Midnight Club 3 or doing an event where a song would play that would make me say, "What the fuck am I listening to right now?" Which is a good sign that the developers learned some good lessons in this field. And really the next difference, arguably one of the biggest changes in the whole series, shows itself as soon as you start a new game and are prompted to select your first car. We are finally treated to real-life, trademarked car manufacturers. A decently large selection of them too. And really, most of the cars you might expect to see in a street racing tuner culture game are present, including Lancers, Supras, the 350Z, Skyline, and the Dodge Neon if you're having a day where you feel particularly like driving trash. That's only some of the import tuner cars in the game, without even mentioning the multiple other categories such as exotics, SUVs, muscle cars, and arguably the category that makes the series stand out the most from others, motorcycles. Needless to say, it's a pretty impressive collection, especially if you consider all of the game's customization options, though I'll talk about that later. You have a choice between 6 cars that you can afford when you start a new career, because that's another thing you have to worry about now. Money. This may be more of a personal preference, but I think that doing events for money is a great deal more satisfying than the sort of progression they had in Midnight Club 2. Pink slip races are fine, but they have to be few and far between. They should be a reward for beating important or difficult characters in the game, and not just something that happens every 3 events. And especially not if that is considered to be the only way of getting new cars to drive. Bonus points if you have to risk losing your own car in pink slip events like in Juiced 2. Racing for cash rewards leaves you open to spend it on whatever you like, which is kind of what makes it so much better than the alternatives. If you start to find that events are getting more difficult, you can start spending it on upgrading your car, and it really doesn't cost that much to apply some basic upgrades. A single car can take you a long way through the career because of this, so eventually saving enough money for an entirely different vehicle also becomes easier. Either if you're feeling like changing things up a bit, or if you found that you have reached your current car's limit in the upgrades department. One thing I will mention though is that car customization, while being rather vast and impressive in a lot of ways, doesn't really have any mechanical purpose to it. Then again, after that fucking stunt that Juiced 2 pulled with sponsorships, yes, I read your comments, you never really know. If you can get discounts based off of having brands plastered on your car, then the game doesn't communicate that fact to the player. This isn't really that much of a criticism. Midnight Club 3 isn't the only game where customizing your car isn't really much other than a money sink. The Underground games had a cool idea with this, even if the end result ended up being having to completely fuck your cars up with stacks of layered vinyls just to get that prestige rank to go up. But at the very least, it meant that you couldn't just drive your stock Miata through the entire game without so much as a set of custom rims. I often find myself driving around with sleeper builds in games like Midnight Club 3 or Most Wanted, simply because I can always use the money for something else, so I have to wonder if there's any possible way to make some car customization required in a game like this, while not making it as ridiculous as Underground 2 for instance. All of that being said, however, I think fans of tuner racing games are quite unique in the fact that they probably don't really need much of a reason to use car customization. Because I mean, it's literally part of the experience in and of itself. Put a decent car customizer in your game and people won't really need much more of an incentive to use it other than it looks cool. So while I wish that more could be done with systems like this, it would be pretty unfair to hold that against Midnight Club 3 as it's already a big improvement over the lack of customization in the last 2 games. But I think I've stalled for long enough now. I'm reviewing a racing game series and yet here I am talking about the music and all of this other stuff. How is the gameplay in Midnight Club 3? If I had to use one word to describe the gameplay in Midnight Club 3, that word would be fast. Even your standard, unmodified cars will take you up to speeds of well over 120 miles per hour, almost 200 kilometers per hour for the boys. Which when combined with how the camera's FOV and motion blur increases the faster you go, really creates a sense of speed that I've rarely experienced in many other games. The sorts of speeds you can easily achieve in Midnight Club 3 can be absolutely brutal if you're not paying attention, and your rival AI will fully take advantage of any mistakes you commit. And as punishing as those mistakes can be, the game balances these high speeds by having a very responsive set of controls. There are some aspects of the way that the cars control in this game that are still very similar to the previous games in the series. Making slight turns to avoid traffic can still be done very quickly whilst maintaining grip, which is kind of a necessity considering how much traffic you have to dodge at these insanely high speeds. Though the way the game deals with oversteer has seen a huge improvement. Similarly to Midnight Club 2, if you slam your steering fully into any direction at high speed, your car will start to skid. However, whereas in that game this was a great way of instantly burning all of your momentum, especially becoming detrimental with some of the late game vehicles, this action has become a lot more arcade-like in Midnight Club 3, and that's because you're not just skidding anymore. You're drifting. Lose grip around the corner in this game, and now it feels like your car is still propelling itself forward as long as you keep your foot down on the gas. You can also force a drift by using your handbrake at any time during a turn, and just this small change to how the cars handle in this game opened up so many options to my driving that it was hard to get my head around the fact that this same company made the two other games I just talked about for well over half an hour. Street racing felt like a borderline bargain bin shovelware game with the way it played, and I can't help to think that if Angel Studios had this control scheme as a foundation since the very beginning, that they could have turned Midnight Club into one of, if not the most, popular racing game series of all time. This is the first game in the series I've played so far that actually feels like it had some proper racing game designers come in to make it feel fun to play, because there's nothing really that stands out to me as an outright bad mechanic in the way the cars feel to control. Yes, I generally prefer games where the cars feel like they have a little bit more weight to them. However, I can put my own preferences like that aside, because Midnight Club 3 is clearly designed with these characteristics in mind. There's too much stuff to dodge in this game to have a weightier control system more similar to that of the Underground games. A lot of the streets are narrow with tight turns around almost every corner, and none of that was very much of a problem for me throughout my playtime because of how light and responsive the cars feel to drive in this game. And the improvements don't just stop at how the game controls to drive. Even though waypoint-based racing isn't my favorite, as I've mentioned before in this video, I probably have the least problems with the way these are implemented in Midnight Club 3 compared to pretty much any other game like it. Although I counted around 2 times where I didn't really know how to get to my next waypoint in a race, 99% of the time the game is very clear in how to get from one checkpoint to another. They tend to be much closer together for one, and they very rarely show up on junctions now as well, meaning that you actually have a second or two to react to where you need to go next. They removed those random order events. Initiating races is now a completely hassle-free experience. The vast majority of races in Midnight Club 3 are started by simply arriving at a marker on the map and flashing your lights. Quick and easy bish bash bosh, you're starting your next race. No need to waste your fucking time chasing some peasant for 3 minutes straight. That's not to say that that old mechanic is gone though. There will usually be around 3 ops driving around that you can go through the old song and dance with. But at least now, the pursuits only last about 30 seconds. The AI knows how to not hit traffic, and they drive slow enough to let you keep up. And speaking of pursuits, I've never really heard much mention of the police pursuits in Midnight Club 3, so it's quite a surprise to see not only how much they have been improved in this franchise, but also just to see how good they were compared to other games released around this time. A lot is said about the police pursuits in Need for Speed Most Wanted, and rightfully so. I've actually heard from some people before that this was one of the only parts of Most Wanted that elevated it up from mediocrity for them. But the thing is, Midnight Club 3 released a whole 7 months before Most Wanted. Cops in this game provide a real challenge during races. It wasn't exactly a rare occurrence to be completely cucked in an event by a roided out cop. There was one event I did where they even managed to pull off a pit maneuver on me, and even if that was just a happy accident, it made an impression nonetheless. Now, granted, everything else about them is still rather basic. You will never be arrested, for instance, even when being pursued past the finish line, where your character is obligated to pull off a sick 180 into a full stop. He just can't help himself. You will also never run into them outside of events, they simply don't spawn in free roam. And really, the only reason why they even stand a chance at catching up to you is because they utilize the old rubber band trick. And oh boy, have I got a lot to say about the AI in Midnight Club 3. It's undeniable, to me at least, that Midnight Club 3 took many steps forward in a lot of ways when comparing it to its predecessors. So much so that it was often easy to overlook some of its shortcomings as I was experiencing it for the first time and formulating my feelings about it. Because out of all of the games in this video, I spent the most time playing Midnight Club 2. And that's for a reason. The thing that ultimately ended my interest in continuing with my playthrough was the AI. To bring back an example from earlier in this video, it's like those talented racing game designers that got brought in showed the fruits of their labor to Rockstar, to which they replied, "Make it harder." The first handful of events at the start of Midnight Club 3 fostered somewhat of a false sense of security within me with how easy they were, a sense that was shattered rather quickly. I felt like I was at the mercy of the other contestants in pretty much every single race in the game after the first initial few. Whereas the lighter feel of your vehicles lended itself well to the fast pace of the events in Midnight Club 3, it was at the detriment of you now being an absolute punching bag for your rival AI to take their anger out on. There was this one race in particular that I restarted something like 24 times, only 20 seconds off of the starting line, because the AI had a particular need to completely wreck everything in their way to fuck me over. They don't really seem to have much of a penalty in hitting civilian traffic, for instance, whereas whenever I do it, it takes my character around 3 weeks just to get over the mental drama of it all. They can seemingly push you around like you weigh absolutely nothing, and yet when you try to do the same to them, it really doesn't seem to affect them all that much. Similarly to the cops, the contestant AI in Midnight Club 3 also has some blatant issues with rubber banding. Most of the time they try to hide it with the excuse that they're just using their nitrous to get ahead, sound effects and all. But after the 4th or 5th time they boost past you in the same event at a stage in the game where you yourself only unlocked one possible tank of nitrous to buy and use once per race, you start to recognize it for what it really is. And no, it's not the slipstream boost. As far as I can tell, the AI doesn't have that ability. Now, before you start writing your comments, I will mention that Midnight Club 3 introduced a number of abilities targeted at solving a lot of these frustrations. Specifically 3, in the form of the Zone, Aggro, and Roar abilities. I will be talking about them in just a moment, but I just wanted to mention them now because I could just preemptively feel the comments imploding on themselves. The cops, even though they do provide much more of a challenge than in the previous games, have all of these negative attributes that I've just described turned up to 11. They have caught up to my modified cars while boosting on multiple occasions. And no matter what you do, if they have that switch flipped, they will not give a single fuck about hitting walls or oncoming traffic. You can push them into other cars at well over 140 miles per hour and they will be right back at you in around 2 seconds. This sort of shit really started to annoy me throughout my time with Midnight Club 3 because there were multiple occasions where I felt less like I had done something wrong and more like the game was just designed to fuck me over. What really adds to this is that same problem of the devs spawning traffic in super awkward positions. Fuck me for trying to take the most optimal routes around corners, I guess. It especially feels cheap in this game because I know know for a fact that when I'm forced to turn extra wide to avoid all of this traffic, the AI is just going to fucking plow its fat ass through all of it without much of a penalty at all. If only there were abilities in the game that allowed you to circumvent these annoyances, am I right? Zone enters the player into a bullet time mode, kind of similar to the speed breaker in Most Wanted. Aggro makes you invulnerable to hitting other vehicles for a short time. Think of how rear-ending traffic works in Burnout Revenge, but it works on oncoming traffic also in this game. And Roar is like a force field that pushes all traffic and contestants away from you in a certain radius. So the game is fixed now, right? If the game gives you the tools to deal with these problems, then why am I complaining? These abilities need sections all of their own to properly explain why they don't really work. But something you should know right off the bat is that these abilities are restricted to certain vehicle classes. Roar is only available to use in muscle cars and choppers, for example. This is going to be an important detail to keep in mind, as it's going to unveil what I'm calling the Midnight Club paradox. Let's start with Zone. It's a slow motion effect available for tuners, sports bikes, and exotics. You fill this ability by driving cleanly and avoiding collisions. I don't think this is the worst out of the three abilities, but it already introduces a problem. A paradox, if you will. That being, if you're already driving cleanly through an event, enough to consistently earn this ability without much of a problem, then you are probably not going to find yourself needing an ability like Zone in the first place, which makes this even easier. And on the other hand, if you find yourself in a race where you're particularly having problems with not hitting traffic or the other contestants, then you're not going to be able to earn the one ability that is meant to make this easier for you. Not to mention that the types of vehicles that can use this ability are already some of the most agile available in the game, whereas the sorts of vehicles that might actually make better use of Zone cannot even use it. Next up is Aggro, the ability to plow through traffic without a speed or damage penalty, which is restricted to SUVs, trucks, and luxury sedans. Spot the odd one out here. You fill this ability up by intentionally colliding with traffic. Are you starting to see the problem here? You have to go out of your way and lose time in a race by hitting traffic to be able to hit more traffic unimpeded. And again, a pattern emerges. Because SUVs and trucks are some of the vehicles that are the least affected by hitting traffic in the first place, both in terms of damage they receive as well as being physically affected. Seeing how they are also a fair bit more difficult to drive, I think that these abilities should have maybe been a little switcherooed or reworked. I think I've kind of made my point clear as is, so I'm not going to go into the Roar ability. I'll just say that it's the least problematic out of the three, because you fill it up by drifting, which is actually a pretty cool idea, considering how that's actually possible now. It also doesn't give you that much of an advantage from my experience. For me, there is a real problem with how these abilities are implemented, and while you could swap them around to try and find a better match between abilities and vehicle types, I think I have a better solution. Let the player pick an ability. Imagine getting your first car in Midnight Club 3. You do a handful of races to rack up some initial cash, get to know how your car handles, and then it's off to the garage for upgrades. Except there's a new category now. Abilities. Zone, Aggro, and Roar. All for the same price, but you are told that you can only buy one and that it cannot be replaced. If you find that you don't like how your car handles around corners, you spend a couple grand on Zone. If traffic gets in the way, you go for either Aggro or Roar. I'm sorry, it's not my fucking fault the devs decided to call something the Roar ability. I think this alone, even with everything else left the way it is, could have been a lot more interesting. Sure, I guess the way the abilities are assigned to the different vehicle classes now kind of makes sense in a way. Like, it kind of makes sense that trucks and SUVs would get the ability to demolish everything in their way for a short time, but it's not exactly like this game is trying to be realistic in many other aspects of how it works. I mean, there's a slipstream boost mechanic for Todd's sake. And just before I close this video off, here's just a few random things I haven't mentioned yet. Weight shifting. I think this is one of the most recognizable mechanics in these games. It's been a part of the Midnight Club franchise since the second game, and yet I've gone through almost an hour without even mentioning it once. And that's because I've never felt the need to use it. In Midnight Club 2, the first race you do in Paris, directly after unlocking this ability, there is an archway that clearly tries to force you to squeeze through it by weight shifting. Too bad for the game, I was already bike-pilled. And I guess the general idea behind it is that you use it to get through tight traffic. But in the same time it takes you to perform this action, you might as well just steer to get out of the way of whatever it is you're about to hit. This kind of ties in with the fact that damage in all of these games so far feels like an underdeveloped mechanic. Never even once throughout my time in all of the games in this series have I felt like I had to pay attention to the condition of my car, which seems like a missed opportunity. It would have been cool if wrecking your opponents was a valid option for dealing with them, even if they got to respawn after a couple of seconds. This could have been a decent solution to the AI in general, as it could have punished them for slamming into everything in their way. Pedestrians have been downgraded through each consecutive game. I figured that the fact that you can't even hit them anymore in Midnight Club 3 could have had something to do with Rockstar trying to lower the game's parental rating, but all the games I've talked about in this video received the same rating of teen in the United States, leaving me a bit puzzled. I imagine it has something to do with their increased capacity on the map, as there does seem to be a lot more pedestrians walking around the different cities in the game, which does make them feel a lot more lived in. Software mode resolution aside, I think this game looks really good. Even with the increased graphical fidelity, it's not to a point where it's hard to see where you're going. That being said, however, the 3 cities included in the dub edition all look rather samey. I can appreciate the reasons for the inclusion of these cities, as they all individually had a lot of influence on tuner culture in different ways. But I would be lying to you if I said I could pick a random clip out of my recordings and tell you exactly which map it takes place in, other than the fact that they all have slightly different skyboxes. It's just another reason for why American cities aren't the best setting for these types of games. I do have to say though that even though these are based on American cities, grids are only limited to the city centers for the most part. Most of the roads you drive on offer enough variety with winds, twists and turns to make them actually fun to race through. So, a lot of mixed feelings about this one. I mentioned earlier that at the end of this project, I ended up spending more time playing Midnight Club 2 over 3. And while some of that is due to how frustrating the game ended up being for me in the end, I think it also just came down to the fact that it was a lot less of a hassle to just double-click that icon on my desktop to play the game at a high frame rate and resolution. It was just a matter of convenience. Because when it comes down to which is the better game, I think the general trend of every Midnight Club game improving over the one before it still applies. Yes, I had a real problem with the AI in Midnight Club 3. However, it's not like this was the only game around 2005 that had this problem. Need for Speed was pretty notorious for rubber banding AI pretty much throughout that entire decade, starting with Underground. And I truly believe that if I wasn't making a video about it and could just enjoy it on my off time, that I would enjoy everything else about Midnight Club 3 enough to keep playing it. Everything from the car customization, to how the cars handle, to the graphics and even the level design makes it hard to believe just how much of a humble beginning this whole franchise started out on. And when it comes down to it, Midnight Club 3 improved far more over the last 2 games than it devolved. If this is your favorite Midnight Club game, then it's not really hard to see why. The thing that it did for me, however, was make me even more excited to try out Midnight Club Los Angeles. Because if this general trend upwards continues, then it should hopefully be one of the greats. 7 out of 10.
Oh shit.
I want you to subscribe to me
Scav Merchant Hub
on YouTube. Thank you, cringe. Bye.